What if your best friend had 4 paws, a fluffy tail, and the cleverest mind in all the kingdom? What if a simple cat could outsmart kings, outwit ogres, and turn a poor miller's son into a prince? This is the story of the most extraordinary cat who ever lived. A cat with a feathered hat, a pair of fancy boots, and a plan that would change everything. Once upon a time, in a land of rolling hills and golden wheat fields, there lived an old miller. He had a cozy mill by the river, a hard-working donkey, and 3 sons. The miller worked hard all his life, but he was never a wealthy man. When he grew old and passed away, he left behind only 3 things to divide among his sons. To his eldest son, he left the mill. To his middle son, he left the donkey. And to his youngest son, Thomas, he left a cat. Just a cat. A ginger tabby with bright green eyes, white paws, and a very fluffy tail. Thomas sat by the roadside, the cat in his lap, and sighed the heaviest sigh you ever heard. "What am I going to do?" he said sadly. "My brothers can make a living with a mill and a donkey, but a cat? I love you dearly, little friend, but you can't help me earn my fortune." The cat looked up at Thomas with his bright green eyes, and then he did something quite unexpected. He spoke. "Don't be so gloomy, master," the cat said in a smooth, confident voice. "I may be just a cat, but I am no ordinary cat. Give me a pair of boots and a leather sack, and I will make your fortune. Trust me." Thomas nearly fell off the fence in shock. "You can talk?" "I can do many things," the cat said with a sly smile. "But first the boots. A gentleman needs proper footwear." Thomas had nothing to lose. He used his last few coins to buy a fine pair of small leather boots and a sturdy sack with a drawstring. He even found a little feathered hat at the market that the cat insisted upon. The cat pulled on the boots, adjusted the hat at a jaunty angle, and swished his tail with satisfaction. "Perfect," he purred. "Now, master, sit tight and leave everything to me." And with that, Puss in Boots, for that is what we shall call him now, set off on his grand adventure. First, Puss went to a meadow where he knew wild rabbits lived. He put some lettuce and carrots in his sack, left it open on the ground, and hid behind a bush. Before long, a plump young rabbit hopped right into the sack to nibble the treats. Quick as a flash, Puss pulled the drawstring tight. "Gotcha," he said with a grin. But Puss didn't eat the rabbit. Oh no, he had much bigger plans. He marched right up to the royal castle, boots clicking on the cobblestones, hat tilted just so, and demanded to see the king. The guards laughed at first. A cat? Wanting to see the king? But Puss was so charming, so confident, so magnificently dressed in his little boots and hat that they let him through just to see what would happen. Puss strode into the throne room, bowed low with a flourish of his hat, and presented the rabbit to the king. "Your Majesty," he announced, "my master, the Marquis of Carabas, sends you this fine rabbit as a gift. He wishes you good health and happiness." Now, there was no Marquis of Carabas. Puss had made up the name on the spot. But the king didn't know that. "How delightful," the king exclaimed. "A gift from the Marquis of Carabas. How thoughtful. Please thank your master for me, good cat." Puss bowed again and left, his tail swishing with satisfaction. Over the next few weeks, Puss brought more gifts to the king: plump partridges, a brace of pheasants, a basket of fresh fish from the river, Each time, he announced that the gifts were from the mysterious Marquis of Carabas. The king grew more and more curious about this generous nobleman he had never met. This Marquis of Carabas must be a fine gentleman indeed, he told his daughter, the princess. So generous, so thoughtful. I should very much like to meet him someday. The princess, whose name was Isabella, was curious too. Anyone who had such a clever, well-dressed cat must be someone special. Then, one day, Puss learned that the king and princess were going for a carriage ride along the river. His bright green eyes sparkled. The time had come for the next part of his plan. He raced back to Thomas, who was still living in a tiny hut, wondering what his strange cat was up to. "Master, quick! You must do exactly as I say," Puss exclaimed. "Go down to the river and swim in the water near the bridge. When the king's carriage passes, I'll take care of the rest." "Swim in the river? But why?" Thomas asked, confused. "Trust me," Puss said with a wink. "Have I let you down yet?" Thomas shrugged and did as he was told. He went down to the river, took off his ragged clothes, and waded into the cool water. Moments later, the royal carriage came rumbling down the road, and that's when Puss sprang into action. "Help! Help!" he cried, running alongside the carriage and waving his hat frantically. "The Marquis of Carabas is drowning! Thieves attacked him and stole his clothes! Help, Your Majesty, help!" The king recognized the clever cat at once. "Stop the carriage," he commanded. "We must save the Marquis." Royal guards rushed to the river and pulled Thomas to safety. Meanwhile, Puss had hidden Thomas's ragged old clothes under a rock. The king, feeling sorry for the robbed nobleman, ordered his servants to bring a fine suit of clothes from the castle. When Thomas was dressed in the elegant outfit, velvet coat, silk shirt, polished shoes, he looked every bit the nobleman. He was young and handsome, and when he smiled shyly at the princess, she blushed and smiled back. "You must ride with us, Marquis," the king insisted. "I won't have you walking after such a dreadful ordeal." And so Thomas, now called the Marquis of Carabas, climbed into the royal carriage and sat beside the princess. They began to talk, and they discovered they liked the same things. Quiet walks in nature, stories about adventures, and the sound of rain on the roof. But Puss wasn't finished yet, not even close. He ran ahead of the carriage faster than you'd think a cat in boots could run, until he reached the vast fields of wheat that stretched along the road. Farmers were working in the fields, harvesting the golden grain. "Listen carefully," Puss called out to them. "The king's carriage is coming this way. When he asks who owns these fields, you must say they belong to the Marquis of Carabas. If you don't, something terrible will happen to you." The farmers were startled by the talking cat, but they were even more frightened by his warning. When the king's carriage arrived and the king asked, "Who owns these magnificent fields?" they all answered at once, "The Marquis of Carabas, Your Majesty." The king was impressed. "My word, Marquis, what beautiful lands you have!" Thomas just smiled nervously and nodded, not quite sure what his clever cat was up to. Puss raced ahead again and found more farmers and more fields, meadows of green grass, orchards of apple trees, vineyards heavy with grapes. At each stop, he gave the same instructions, and at each stop, when the king asked who owned such wonderful land, the answer was always the same. "The Marquis of Carabas, Your Majesty." The king was amazed. The princess was impressed. And Thomas was completely bewildered, but in a good way. But now came the most dangerous part of Puss's plan. All these lands, the fields, the orchards, the vineyards, actually belonged to a fearsome ogre who lived in a huge castle at the top of the hill. The ogre was mean and cruel, and he had powerful magic. He could transform himself into any creature he wished. Puss marched right up to the ogre's castle and knocked on the enormous door. Boom, boom, boom. The door swung open, and there stood the ogre. He was massive, 3 times the height of a man, with bulging muscles, sharp tusks, and eyes like burning coals. "Who dares disturb me?" the ogre roared. Puss didn't flinch. He swept off his hat and bowed elegantly. "Good day, mighty ogre. I was simply passing through and heard the most extraordinary rumors about you. They say you have the power to transform yourself into any creature, even a lion. But surely that can't be true. Such magic would be far too difficult for anyone." The ogre's pride was touched. "Too difficult? Watch this." In a flash of smoke and fire, the ogre transformed into an enormous lion with a golden mane and teeth as long as daggers. He roared so loudly that the whole castle shook. Puss pretended to be terrified, leaping onto a cabinet and puffing up his fur. "Oh my! Most impressive. Truly remarkable." The ogre transformed back, looking very pleased with himself. "But," Puss continued slyly, "I imagine it's easy to become something big and fierce. The real test of magic would be to become something tiny, like a mouse. But no, that would be impossible, even for a powerful ogre like yourself." "Impossible?" the ogre bellowed. "Nothing is impossible for me." And in a puff of smoke, the mighty ogre transformed into a tiny brown mouse, scurrying across the floor, which was exactly what Puss had been waiting for. Pounce! One quick jump, one swift snap, and that was the end of the ogre. Puss licked his whiskers, straightened his hat, and walked to the front gate just as the king's carriage arrived at the castle. "Welcome, your majesty," Puss announced with his grandest bow. "Welcome to the castle of the Marquis of Carabas." The king stared up at the magnificent castle with its tall towers and golden flags. "This is your castle, Marquis? Why, it's the finest in all the land." Thomas was speechless. Princess Isabella squeezed his hand excitedly, and Puss just smiled his clever cat smile. Inside, a great feast had been prepared. The ogre had been expecting guests of his own. You see, and the king, princess, and Thomas sat down to the finest meal any of them had ever tasted. By the time dinner was finished, the king had made up his mind. "Marquis of Carabas," he said warmly, "you are clearly a fine young man with a kind heart, a generous spirit, and excellent taste in cats. I would be honored if you would marry my daughter." Thomas looked at Isabella. Isabella looked at Thomas, and both of them smiled, the biggest smiles. "I would be honored, your majesty," Thomas said, and he meant it with all his heart. The wedding was held the very next week. The whole kingdom celebrated. Thomas, who everyone now truly believed was the Marquis of Carabas, married Princess Isabella in the castle that had once belonged to the ogre. And Puss in Boots? He became the most famous cat in all the land. He never had to chase mice again unless he wanted to, just for fun. He had a velvet cushion by the fire, cream with every meal, and all the respect a clever cat could wish for. Thomas never forgot where he came from. He shared his fortune with his brothers, helped the farmers who had helped him, and ruled the land with kindness and fairness, always with his best friend Puss by his side. "You know," Thomas said one evening, scratching Puss behind the ears, "when Father left me a cat instead of a mill, I thought I was the unluckiest person in the world, but you turned out to be the greatest treasure of all." Puss purred contentedly. "That's not what you're given that matters, Master. It's what you do with it. And together, we did pretty well, didn't we?" Thomas laughed. "We certainly did. Because sometimes, the most unexpected gifts turn out to be the best ones. And sometimes, a loyal friend with a clever plan and a very good pair of boots can change your whole life." And they all lived happily, with full hearts and endless adventures for the rest of their days. The end. Thank you so much for listening to today's fairy tale. I hope Puss's story reminded you that cleverness and loyalty can take you anywhere, and that the best treasures in life often come with 4 paws and a fluffy tail. Until next time, sweet dreams, my dreamers.